Okay, so this thing is not going to work. Okay. So we're on Daf Chav Zayin, towards the middle of the page, the beginning of the wide lines. The Mishnah says, "B'tainios b'shal zacharim kfufim upia mitzupa kesef." That there's a difference between Rosh Hashana and the shofar of Rosh Hashana, as opposed to the shofar of a tainus. Because on a tainus, on a public fast day, they had to blow the shofar. And we'll see that in Parshas Baaloscha. And then afkamina between the shofar of Rosh Hashana and the shofar of tainus is that whereas the shofar of Rosh Hashana cannot be mitzupa kesef, you cannot line the shofar with gold. And again, we'll see exactly whether it's on the inside of the shofar, the outside of the shofar. But the shofar of a tainus was deliberately lined with gold. Give me a better word, not lined, but layered. No, what word am I looking for?
Gilded?
No, what word am I looking for?
Inlaid?
Or overlaid?
No. Mitzupa zav. How do you say that in English? You don't have an art school. What's the word I'm looking for? Coated. Maybe we'll use the word coated. I'm not sure if that's the word I'm looking for, but it's gold coated. C-O-A-T, right? So the Gemara asks immediately, Maishna Hasam, why is that the case of tainus is different? Dissolve, that we actually coat it with gold, the shofar. Umaishna Hacha, the kesef.
Silver plated.
Plated. Excellent.
Plated.
That's the word I needed. Plated. Not coated, but plated. Okay. Okay. So now let's backtrack a little bit. A shofar of Rosh Hashanah cannot be plated, neither with silver nor with gold, except in the Beis HaMikdash. Remember that we discussed yesterday that there's a separate mitzvah of blowing shofar in the Mikdash. And as we discussed at great length, it was accompanied by the blowing of the trumpets. And we don't apply the principle of Trei Koli Lo Mishtamoy because it's Chavivale, everything that we discussed yesterday. But there's a separate din of the shofar of Rosh Hashanah b'Mikdash. Again, you have to add that word b'Mikdash. And the Rosh Hashanah in Mikdash was plated with gold. But the shofar of a tainus was plated with silver. So we have three levels. We have the Rosh Hashanah shofar for all of us. No plating whatsoever, not gold, not silver. We have the plating of the gold shofar of Mikdash on Rosh Hashanah. And then we have the shofar of Tainios, which is plated with silver. So the Gemara now is going to offer two interpretations, two answers to the question as to the distinction between the shofar of Rosh Hashanah in Mikdash, which is gold-plated, as opposed to the shofar of Tainus, which is silver-plated. Let's see the first answer. Ibai Sema, Kol ki nufya de kesevu dechsiv. Now we go back to Parshas Baaloscha, which is the source for blowing the shofar on a tainus. Aselecha shtei chatzotzos kesef, v'hayu lemikra ha'eda. So what is the purpose of the trumpets, of the chatzotzos? There are many different purposes of the chatzotzos, but one of which is lemikra ha'eda, to gather the people together. Let's say, for example, when they went out to battle and Klal Yisrael were spread out amongst the Machna, to gather them together, they blew the trumpets. There are other functions of Chatzotzos. So that's called in the Talmudic Aramaic kinufia. Kinufia means the gathering together. In Hebrew, we would call it Knesset. Knesset means the assembly. We gather together. So Knufia has to be with Kesef. What's the relationship between Knufia and Kesef? That we see in the pasuk of Chatzotzos, the purpose of which was Knufia, and the Torah says, Aseh lecha shtei Chatzotzos Kesef. So on Tainus, why do we blow the shofar? Also for Knufia. Now, halacha of Knufia applies not only, as I said earlier, when we go out to battle and we gather together the forces, but also on a Tainus, when we gather together the people and assemble them for tefillah, for tachanunim, for petition to the Almighty. Tainus means that there's a mashber, there's a crisis in Klal Yisrael, and the urgency of that crisis requires tefillah and Tainus. And the tefillah and Tainus is a matter of tzibur. Like, for example, we find in Tainus Esther, where Esther says to Mordechai, Lech knos es kol ha-Yehudim asher b'Shimshon b'Shushan v'tzumo alai, etc., etc. So the Tainus of Esther was introduced with the word knos. Lech knos es kol ha-Yehudim. You remember that pasuk? I'm assuming you remember that pasuk because you've heard the Megillah twice annually for the last I don't know how many years. Lech knos es kol ha-Yehudim. So the purpose and the goal of Tkiyas Shofar on a Tainus is kinufia, right? Is to gather the people. And therefore, like the Chatzotzos that are made of silver for the purpose of kinufia, to gather together the people, let's say to go out to battle or to perhaps be counted in the census, or maybe before Shabbos, we want to notify the entire public, whatever it might be, that addressing of the public is Chatzotzos, which is made of kesef, and therefore the Tainus in which we require the blowing of the shofar for the purpose of gathering the people for tefillah and tachnunim, that shofar should be plated with silver. So it's very interesting. The Gemara seems to be in favor of Zahav, and the exception to the rule, which has to be justified, is the case of Tkiyos, the shofar of a Tainus, meaning if not for the equation between the shofar of Tainus and the Chatzotzos, we would have assumed that just like we plate the shofar in Migdash of Rosh Hashana with gold, we should plate the shofar of Tainus with gold. That would have been our first stop on the road. Our second stop on the road is that there's a halacha of kinufia, and the purpose of blowing the shofar on Tainus is kinufia, and that leads us and links us to the Chatzotzos, whose purpose was kinufia, and the Chatzotzos required kesef. You know, I'm thinking out loud here. I'm wondering, why is it then on a Tainus we have to blow a shofar to gather people together for tefillah and tachnunim, why not just blow chatzotzos? So maybe Bisman is after Churban Abayis, maybe there's no chatzotzos because chatzotzos have a status of clay migdash. We don't have a migdash, we don't have chatzotzos, so we blow a shofar. But what about at the time that the migdash stood? If they had to declare a fast day, would they blow a shofar? Maybe they should blow chatzotzos. I don't know. Maybe that's what they did. They blew chatzotzos. I simply don't know. Do you have any notes, perhaps, that ask this question? Why don't we blow chatzotzos on a time? All right, let's go on for the meantime. Ibai Sema's second answer to explain and justify the distinction between the plating of the shofar of Migdash Rosh Hashanah with gold and the plating of the shofar of Tinios with silver. HaTorah chasa al mamonim shel Yisrael. Gold is very expensive, and the Torah wanted to protect the finances of Klal Yisrael. So the Torah has compassion, and apparently Kesef would do. Again, it's not your first ideal choice. You should have used so. Yeah, Don, you found something?
Yeah, it's not in a footnote, but I missed it because it's in the actual paragraph. It says, since the purpose of blowing the shofar on a fast day is to assemble the people for prayer, that's why they blew the silver shofar on fast days.
Can you run that by me one more time?
The idea is that since I'm in
Are you free Thursday?
Okay, I'll talk to you. I'm sorry, I apologize.
No.
It says that since the purpose of blowing the shofar on a fast day is to gather the people, so they blew the silver shofar on a fast day. So it's the same idea. They're gathering the people.
No, that I understand, but I was just asking if the chatzotzos were blown in the Torah, that's what it says in Parashat Balos, in order to gather the people, why not use the chatzotzos on a time? That's what I'm wondering about. Why is shofar not chatzotzos? You know, the shofar is the ram's horn, and the chatzotzos are the trumpets that were made of silver. Why not use the trumpets on a time? That's what I was wondering if anybody asked that question. I'm sure they do.
Actually,
Okay, so I'm gonna. How do I do this? All right. No. So Don, if you don't mind going under again, you'll just get a chance. Okay. So now he says the following: the expense of paying gold, right? Of paying gold is a lot greater than buying silver. And therefore, the Torah lowered the standards in the case of the shofar of Tainus. Again, we don't know why the Torah wouldn't have that same compassion in the case of the shofar of Rosh Hashanah in the Migdash. We'll have to see about that. But as far as the Tainus is concerned, the Torah let us get out cheap, I guess you'd say, get off cheap, and use silver instead of gold. That's called HaTorah Chasal Mamonim Shel Yisrael. If I'm not mistaken, the Gemara tells us that in the second Beis HaMikdash, when the Jews were relatively poor, not like during Shlomo Melech's time, they were very rich. So the Gemara says that the menorah itself was made of another metal substance. It was not made of Zav, as it was in the first Beis HaMikdash, also activating this same principle, HaTorah Chasal Mamonim Shel Yisrael. So anyway, this principle of HaTorah Chasal Mamonim Shel Yisrael is a principle that we'll see applies in many different contexts. So now the Gemara asks our question. Hasam Nami on Rosh Hashanah as well. Navid de Kesef. Why did the Torah have Rachmanus on the Mammon of Klal Yisrael and allow us to plate the shofar of Rosh Hashanah for the Beis Hamikdash with kesef? And the Gemara answers, afilu hachi kvod yontif adif. So we have a collision here, a tug of war between two principles, each of which is pulling in the opposite direction. One principle is haTorah chas al mamonim shel Yisrael. The other principle is kvod yontif. That Rosh Hashana is the yontif, and the shofar is being blown on Rosh Hashana on a yontif, and the covet of yontif demands or requires that we give it the full kavod, and the best ideal kavod would be zahav, and therefore that trumps the Torah chas al mamoni. So for the sake of kavod yontiv, the Torah ups the ante on the shofar, requires that it be plated with the expense of gold, and trumps the principle of Torah chas al mamoni shel Yisrael. Now, what bothers my mind is, again, maybe you'll find something in the footnote, why did the Gemara need to advocate in favor of Kvod Yontif and not in favor of Kvod Migdash? That the Beis HaMikdash itself requires kavod, right? There's a mitzvah to honor the Beis HaMikdash, and that itself should generate a requirement of zav. In any event, he says here, mitzvahs Kvod Yontif matzricha lahavdil es Rosh Hashana litova yoser mishar yemos Hashana v'hol ubishal tiny is kavu litzaposam bekesef horu litzapos is Rosh Hashana shuyantif bizav. More or less what we said, but I'm not sure why the dimension of kvod migdash doesn't kick in over here.
I mean, would that not go along with, not having gold involved with the egel? And so we don't want to.
Like the Kohen Gadol doesn't wear gold when he goes.
Right.
To the Mikdash.
So we can't do it in honor of the Mikdash, but we can do it to honor the Yom Tov.
In other words, it seems that the Ein Kateger Nasa Sanegar only applies in the Kodesh Kodashim. This shofar blowing in the Mikdash was not taking place in the Kodesh Kodashim. So the Gemara could not have excluded Zav on Rosh Hashanah based on the Egel HaZav, because that only applies Lifnai v'Lifniv. Like the Gemara says, there were many parts of the Mikdash that were made of gold. Like, for example, the Aron that housed the Luchos HaBris was plated with gold.
I mean, the Kruvim had gold too, right? I mean, that's in the.
So you're asking, why isn't that Lifnai v'Lifniv? So the Gemara says because it's not a gavra, no, it's not worn by the person. Now you're asking, maybe when the shofar was blown in the Mikdash, that's considered that he came in wearing the gold, right? The plate of gold on the shofar. Yeah, but it's not in Kodesh Kadosh. So you need two conditions. You need that the Kohen be wearing the big day zav when he comes in to do the avodah, and you need that the avodah be done in the Kodesh Kadosh. Then we apply the principle of Ein Kateger Nasa Neger, we exclude zav, which reminds us of the Egel HaZav. But if any of those two conditions are lacking, so for example, it's not the Kohen Gadol or the Kohen who's Oved who's coming in with gold, or alternatively, he's not going into the Kodesh Kodashim, there's no Ein Kateger Nasa Neger, we can use gold. And that's going to be the case of the shofar of Migdash on Rosh Hashanah. Why do we need gold and not apply the principle of Torah Chas al Mamon Shosor, which we do apply for the shofar of Tainios? And there the Gemara says because of Kavod Yontif. Why the Gemara couldn't have made the distinction of Kvod Migdash, that eludes my mind, my understanding. Unless, I don't know, this is something that has to be it has to be investigated one way or the other. Maybe the shofar on the Tainus was blown in the Beis Hamikdash. Is that possible? One second. There may be a possibility of checking this out. Let me just see. The tiniest shells of farm Krufen Pyramid Super Kessel. Aleph Milchus tiniest Aloha. Now, let me just take a minute here. There's Aleph. Milchus tiniest. Ah, interesting. The Rama writes that on a Tainus, im hoya b'migdash, Miriam b'chatzotzos u'b'shofar. Okay, so two chidushim here for me personally. I don't know. Number one, that even on a Tainus, the shofar was accompanied by chatzotzos. I didn't know that. But he says that there was a blowing of a shofar in the Migdash on a Tainus. So that might explain why the shofar of a Tainus is plated with silver. I'm sorry, the shofar, just one second, what do I want to say? No, this actually supports my kasha. Why wouldn't the shofar of a Tainus in Migdash be plated with gold for the covered Migdash? You understand? The Gemara only says covered Yontif because it's Rosh Hashana. Okay, so that's a question that I'll leave you with here. Rav Papa Bar Shmuel Savar Lemevid Uvda Kemas Nisan. So he wanted to blow on Rosh Hashanah with Chatzotros together with the shofar, right? Because the Mishnah tells us that the shofar was accompanied by Chatzotros. And again, we're not talking about a Titus here. We're talking now about Rosh Hashanah. Now, clearly, Rav Papa was after the Churban Abayis, and yet he was blowing Chatzotros. That itself is a chiddush. Oh, so that's what the Gemara is going to object. Amalei Rava. Rava says to Rav Papa, why are you blowing Chatzotros on Rosh Hashanah? Lo Amru El B'Migdash. I mean, you're after the Churban Abayis, and yet you're still blowing Chatzotros on Rosh Hashanah? Tanya Nami Hochi, and Rav quotes a brisa to support him. Bamedvar Murim, when do we accompany the shofar on Rosh Hashanah with Chatzotros? That's only the Migdash. Aval B'Gvulin, outside the Migdash, is Mokom Sheyesh Chatzotros, Ein Shofar. Mokom Sheyesh Shofar, Ein Chatzotros. So, Rabosa, let's learn this Gemara backwards, from the bottom up. B'Mokom Sheyesh Chatzotros. I'm sorry. I'm going to start backwards. Yeah. B'Mokom Sheyesh Shofar, Ein Chatzotros. And that's referring to Rosh Hashanah. So in Rosh Hashanah, we're going to blow the shofar. And that's outside of the Mikdash. That's Gvulin. And we're going to drop the Chatzotros. So at this point, we're holding that Chatzotros is inappropriate outside the Mikdash. But let's go back to the previous statement, which is more complicated. Mokom sheyesh chatzotros, ein shofar. So this clearly indicates that there is chatzotros outside of the Mikdash, because he's talking about Gvulin, which might apply bisman hazeh, that in our time we might be blowing chatzotros. So what does it mean, Mokom sheyesh chatzotros? He writes here, Kigon b'tainios. That's Rashi. So the main mitzvah of blowing on a tainus is chatzotros. And that's what we derive from Baaloscha, from Parshas Baaloscha. The shofar is secondary. So it seems like even bisman hazeh, after the Churban, we don't have the Mikdash and we're in Gvulin, we're going to blow chatzotros on a tainus and leave out the shofar. But what do you mean leave out the shofar? We just finished the whole sugya about the shofar of Tainios, which was plated with silver. So I'm sure there's a footnote on this, Don, but I just want to figure it out on my own before you tell me what it says in the note. I'm really perplexed here. Again, we're saying Maybe it works like this. Our previous sugya about plating the shofar of a tinus with silver, not with gold, is in the Beis HaMikdash. That's where they blew the shofar on a tinus, in the Mikdash, as we saw in the Rambam. And that's why the Gemara could apply the principle of HaTorah Chasal Mamonim Shel Yisrael to the shofar of a tinus, because it doesn't have the element of Kavod Yontif, and not apply the principle of Kvod Migdash. In other words, Kvod Migdash does not require Zav. I don't know why, but it doesn't require Zav, and Kesef will do. So then, one second, so then the shofar, so the shofar of tinus, despite the fact that it was blown in the Mikdash, was plated with silver because it didn't have the element of Kvod Yontif. Tinus is not a Yontif. So far, so good. The shofar of tinus outside of the Mikdash was completely omitted. It's only in the Mikdash that the blowing of the chatzotros on a tinus was accompanied with the shofar. The shofar becomes secondary on a tinus, and the primary mitzvah is to blow the chatzotros. And then Afkamina is going to be outside the Mikdash. Outside the Mikdash, we're only going to blow the ikar and not the tafel, not the secondary accompaniment. So we're going to completely omit the shofar. And that's what he says. Aval b'gvulin makom sheyeh shofar, the chatzotros, which means the tinus. When we blow the chatzotros, we're going to drop the shofar. There's only in the Mikdash that on a tinus we blow chatzotros, and as a secondary add-on, we're going to blow the shofar. And that shofar could be plated with silver because it's not yontif, it's a tinus. And that's in the Mikdash. Outside the Mikdash, on a tinus, we'll just do the ikar ha-mitzvah, which is to blow chatzotros. Gather together the people for tefillah and tachnunim on a tinus. We don't need the shofar at all. Now we get to Rosh Hashana. On Rosh Hashana is makom sheyeh shofar, the ikar mitzvah shofar. In the Beis HaMikdash, the shofar was flanked on both sides with chatzotros. Outside the Beis HaMikdash, which would mean Bisman Hazeh for sure, the shofar is a standalone. We don't need to accompany it with chatzotros because the chatzotros are secondary. They're only an accompaniment. They're background music to the shofar. The ikar mitzvah on Rosh Hashanah is the shofar. So in the Mikdash, the Torah commands us to accompany the shofar with the background music of the chatzotros. But out of the Mikdash, we go back to the ikar mitzvah. In the case of tinus, the ikar mitzvah is chatzotros, so we're going to drop the shofar. That's outside the Mikdash. Outside the Mikdash on Rosh Hashanah, we'll drop the chatzotros because the ikar mitzvah is shofar. That's what I understand. Now, Don, I'm ready for your footnote. Can you read the footnote? I think I don't have an article, but I assume there's got to be a footnote on this.
There's one footnote, but it's more confusing than you stated it more succinctly. It says the Baraisa seemingly states that on fast days, only trumpets are blown outside the temple. The Rishonim, therefore,
and slowly on a fast day,
right? Only trumpets are blown outside the Beit HaMikdash.
Good.
Right. The Rishonim, therefore, find difficult the Genoic responsa that state that the practice was to blow shofars on fast days.
because on a fast day we should be blowing exclusively trumpets and not shofars.
Yeah. Rashba suggests that the Baraisa means only that trumpets and shofars may not be blown together. However, either one may be blown alone.
So in other words, they didn't blow it simultaneously. They could blow both shofar and chatzotzros, or maybe the other way around, chatzotzros first and then shofar, bazeh harzeh in sequence. That's what I think the Rashba is saying.
Yeah, except on Rosh Hashana when you blow only the shofar, it says.
On Rosh Hashana, since the
Only the
Ikar mitzvah is shofar, then outside the Migdash, we go back to the Ikar mitzvah and we drop the chatzotzros. In Migdash, we always require both shofar and chatzotzros, but still there'll be a fundamental difference between Rosh Hashana and Tainus insofar as the plating of the shofar. In the Beis HaMikdash, on Rosh Hashanah, where there's Kavod Yontif, then the Kavod Yontif trumps Chasa al Mamonim Shel Yisrael, and we require that the shofar be plated with gold. On Tainus, where there's no Yontif, and there's no Kvod Yontif, then although we'll blow both shofars and chatzotzros, but nevertheless, the shofar is not going to be plated with gold because HaTorah Chas HaMamonim Shel Yisrael, and that's all of the Beis HaMikdash. Outside the Beis HaMikdash, on Tainus, we're going to blow the chatzotzros and drop the shofars, and on Rosh Hashanah, outside the Mikdash, we'll blow the shofar and drop the chatzotzros. Okay, then? So that's what we have here in this sugya. Make a note of where we got up to for Mirza Hashem tomorrow. Okay, then?
We're not meeting tomorrow, right? It's Wednesday.
Tomorrow's Wednesday. Oh yeah, tomorrow's the day of this week that I can't be there. I have a 6-week program in another yeshiva that's here in Efrat with the Australians and the South Africans. So Mitzvah will meet on Thursday. Again, I have something on Thursday, but it doesn't conflict with this year. And I might just drop that whole thing on Thursday. Actually, as soon as we finish, I'm going to write an email and see if I can get out of it. If their commitment is that they're relying on me, that's one thing. But I'm hoping that they'll easily find a substitute for me. Okay, then? I'll keep you posted about Thursday, 9:35. Okay?